In this first video, I want to discuss Wallace Stevens's essay, The Figure of the Youth as Virile Poet, the first half. This essay appears in a collection called The Necessary Angel, Essays on Reality and the Imagination by Wallace Stevens. You should have access to it through Internet Archive in the link that I sent to you earlier. Now, Wallace Stevens, and here he is, his collected poems, is often regarded as the greatest of the American modernist poets. And so it might be useful to begin with a word about what modernism is. Modernism is regarded as a literary movement, a successor of Romanticism. And so it's often contrasted with Romanticism, which it grows out of. Probably the best known feature of modernism is its difficult and obscure character. Modernism challenges the notion of a ready-made tradition that can provide an assured framework for social meaning and understanding. It's associated with free verse, denying inherited verse forms. It strives for impersonality and objectivity, and often challenges philosophy to the right to define truth. So we can summarize these once again here. Modernism is usually contrasted with Romanticism. It's known for being difficult and obscure. It challenges tradition and shared social meaning. It's often associated with free verse or the denial of inherited verse forms. It strives for impersonality and objectivity. And it's known for being philosophical and indeed for challenging philosophy for the right to define truth. Modernist poets in America were deeply schooled in and influenced by philosophy, especially the Golden Age at Harvard, which featured figures such as William James, Josiah Royce, George Santayana, who was a particular influence on Wallace Stevens. George Santayana was a Spanish-American poet as well as a philosopher. And also Alfred North Whitehead, who was a contributor to symbolic logic and to process philosophy, the inventor of what became known as process philosophy. So, in other words, in the background to Stevens's development of his conception of poetry, there's a sense of the state of modern philosophy. He's not someone who is writing naively in relationship to philosophy, but from a fairly sophisticated understanding of the current status of philosophy in the culture of his time, and that informs some of his rather pessimistic views about philosophy, and also, therefore, his understanding of where poetry comes in, perhaps in some ways to the rescue of philosophy. And this is, as we've seen, has been a very common theme in this course. Okay, on to the figure of the youth as virile poet. I'm going to be going through the first 4 sections of this essay in this video, and we'll read it fairly closely. And we'll pause at various points, and I will try to raise some questions for discussion. You might want to take note of those to contribute your discussion comments in the comments section to this video. So there's a very provocative opening to this essay. Stevens says, "It appears that what is central to philosophy is its least valuable part." What is central to philosophy is its least valuable part. Now, things are not looking very good for philosophy right off the bat, if what's central to philosophy is its least valuable part. But that, of course, immediately raises questions in our mind. What is central to philosophy, after all? What do we think of when we think of philosophy? Think about that. Philosophy is, we say, by definition, the love of wisdom. So there's one possible answer that immediately occurs to us. Wisdom seems to be central to philosophy. But what do we mean by wisdom? A kind of knowledge? truth? A worldview? These are some questions that we should be asking at this point. And he says this is its least valuable part, which suggests both that there's a hierarchy of values that attaches to philosophy, and that some parts of it are more valuable than others, and that perhaps what's valuable about philosophy is something that we tend to overlook about it. He does seem to be implying here not just that, we're mistaken about where the value of philosophy lies, but that there is some value to philosophy. So it's not completely negative. So this immediately raises in our mind the question of what is this value that is being overlooked? And what are we overestimating or valuing in an excessive way about philosophy? Now, Stevens doesn't immediately answer this question or explain to us what is central to philosophy or what its least valuable and most valuable parts are. Instead, what he does, as he does in several places in this essay, is he produces some quotations from prominent intellectuals of his day or of recent eras in the past. And what he seems to be doing here is reflecting a kind of desire to reflect the cultural spirit of the time. He wants to be a cultural critic here and to show how people are thinking about philosophy in his time. What is the avant-garde of conceptions of philosophy and later on of poetry in the period in which he lives and in which he is writing? So this is not meant to be just a personal, idiosyncratic sort of description of what's central to philosophy and what's valuable and not valuable of it, but rather a reflection of the way people in general, at least the leading minds, seem to be thinking about it, or some of the leading minds, I should say. So there's a quotation here from Henry Bradley, who was editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, the famous OED, that is probably the Bible of the English language, containing the most compendious account of the words of the English language and their histories and so on. And he's writing a letter to Robert Bridges, who is Britain's poet laureate. Why do I mention the titles of these figures or the roles that they played? Well, it reflects the way in which Stevens is attempting to channel the cultural aristocracy or elite of his day. That he's not just speaking for himself. And I slipped in the word James there because, as we'll see, William James is another figure that he will add to this list, another member of the intellectual aristocracy of his time. So let's look at the quote from Bradley. He says, quoting, "My own attitude towards all philosophies old and new is very skeptical. Not that I despise philosophy or philosophers, but I feel that the universe of being is too vast to be comprehended even by the greatest of the sons of Adam. We do get, I believe, glimpses of the real problems, perhaps even of the real solutions. But when we have formulated our questions, I fear we have always substituted illusory problems for the real ones." So you see here a very skeptical, as he says, a very skeptical attitude towards philosophy. This is from someone who had a sense of the extent of what there is to be known. This is someone who was overseeing this tremendous research project of the Oxford English Dictionary. So he knew how much there was to be known and how much we didn't know. And because of this, he says, he's skeptical that any son of Adam, right, any human being, could comprehend this vast universe of being. We only get glimpses of the real problems and solutions. And when we formulate our questions, we don't even know if we have the right questions. We don't even know if the problems that we think of as philosophical problems, think here of something like the mind-body problem, the problem of free will, etc. We don't even know if those are really the right problems, if they correspond to anything real. Are there minds? Is the will real? Those are the kind of questions that we can't really be certain about. So it's a very skeptical attitude towards philosophy. Okay, so this raises the question for us, of course, why is Stevens bringing this up? Why is he including the quote, right? Well, there are two more quotes in this section. One is from Paul Valéry, who is a very influential French cultural figure, maybe the most important French critic of around this period. So another member of the cultural elite aristocracy. And the quotation here is in French, so I won't attempt to read it because my French accent is truly atrocious. But the gist of it is that this additional figure, Henri Bergson, who was probably the leading philosopher of the time, French philosopher, is regarded by Valéry as being sort of the end of an era, right? A figure who is maybe the last of a line of great thinkers. That's from Valéry. And then the final quote is from William James, who I mentioned in a little slip there earlier, which is taken from a letter that James sent to Bergson himself, in which James says the following. I'm going to quote him. Quote, "You, Bergson, may be amused at the comparison, but in finishing it, I found the same aftertaste remaining as after finishing Madame Bovary, such a flavor of persistent euphony. You may be amused by this," right? So Bergson here, James is, by the way, he's referring to Bergson's work, Creative Evolution. So one of his great works of philosophy. And presumably the goal here was not to create persistent euphony, right? Pleasant sounding and kind of poetic sounding text, but rather to produce something that is, definitive of the nature of being, of the nature of reality, the truth with a capital T. And James says here, oh, this is such a pretty work, right? It sounded so beautiful. I love your French, this kind of idea. And that, of course, is very telling for Stevens. And it gives us a hint, although Stevens, as a great subtle modernist poet, is too hesitant to let the cat out of the bag immediately. But it gives us a hint as to what he might have meant by this provocative opening line. Remember, it appears that what is central to philosophy is its least valuable part. This suggests that the valuable part of philosophy is not what appears to be its central part, namely its attempt to define the truth, to define the nature of being in some kind of ultimate and final way, but rather its poetic qualities. Not its appeal to reason, but its appeal to the imagination. And that's anticipating where Stevens is going to be going with this. He's going to be trying to draw a contrast here between the philosophical appeal to reason, which may end up ultimately leaving us feeling unfulfilled and disappointed and skeptical, and the poetry's appeal to the imagination, which may provide us with a kind of fulfillment, an unexpected kind of fulfillment, one that we weren't looking for, but that perhaps can provide an apt substitute for the philosophical fulfillment that seems to be lacking, at least in the modern period now. Okay, so continuing on to section 2. What I want to start with here is that Stevens appears to view these statements from the first section as representative of a prevalent modern attitude, which is skepticism not only about philosophy, but about truth itself. Skepticism not only about philosophy, but about truth itself. In other words, in the modern era, it seems that we have lost any confidence that any single philosophy can be the final word of truth. That's the first point. We don't have confidence any longer that the truth is something accessible to us. Or if it is, it's accessible only in a very temporary, a very transient, a very impermanent way. In the modern era, we've lost any confidence that any single philosophy can be the final word of truth. Second point is that the nature of truth changes. He says, perhaps for no more significant reason than that philosophers live and die. So this seems to draw a close connection between the personality of the individual philosopher and the truth, with a small t now, not a capital T truth, an absolute ultimate truth, but a small truth, a truth that is relative to the individual philosopher and their individual personality. And so the picture he seems to be painting here is an individual philosopher comes along with a compelling worldview, a compelling argument, influences perhaps the era of his time, but then that era passes, the philosopher dies, and a new philosopher comes along with a new truth. So we don't have any final word of truth. This supports, of course, the first point that I just made. In the modern era, we've lost any confidence that any single philosophy can be the final word of truth because, perhaps, the nature of truth changes, and that happens perhaps for no more significant reason than that philosophers live and die. So here, again, this is a very provocative view of truth and, of course, a controversial one. So some questions for discussion. And here's the first point where you might pause the video to think about this and add a comment. What conception of truth does this seem to presuppose? Is truth something that exists independently of our conceptions of it, objectively? Or is it just what human society defines it to be? That's the question that's raised by this. And of course, one thing that we might immediately think about is, well, this might be true of some truths. That is, there might be relative truths about, say, morality or aesthetics, but what about scientific truths? Is this also true of scientific truths? On the other hand, just as the truth about what's regarded as morally correct or what's regarded as beautiful can be seen in history to evolve and to change throughout history, we also see scientific revolutions that seem to change our conception of what reality is in a physical sense or biological sense. And so perhaps the idea of the lack of any final word on truth applies to science as much as it does to the realms of aesthetics and morality. So those are some things that you can think about and share your views on. At any rate, Stevens moves on to define philosophy and poetry against this background view of skepticism about philosophy and relativism about truth. And so I'm going to clean off my whiteboard here. And we're going to add some remarks here about the nature of philosophy and how he defines philosophy and how he defines poetry in relation to his definition of philosophy. So philosophy and poetry are going to be defined here as sort of parallel terms, contrasting terms, symmetrical terms. The definitions are definitions that he regards clearly as being tentative. He says these are definitions for convenience sake, and as we'll see going on, he's really rather skeptical of the idea that you can define these things. But the idea seems to be, well, just for the sake of discussion, let's give these sort of provisional, temporary definitions of philosophy and poetry, and then we can see whether this is useful for our purposes at all. So, first of all, his definition of philosophy, he says, philosophy is the official view of being. Philosophy is the official view of being. And I'll fix my F there. Philosophy is the official view of being. And this is almost kind of a sarcastic definition. It's kind of a funny definition, is that philosophy is the official view of being. As if there's an office somewhere, office of being. right? Where there's the official view of what it is. But there's some seriousness to this too. If we think about, well, what would examples of this be? First of all, take a step back. To say that there's an official view of being, this suggests that the truth about existence, the truth about what is just what society defines it to be, right? It's just what the office of being defines it to be. But who holds the office of being? Well, maybe society as a whole. Maybe this is something like the conventional view of being that's in the air, that people take for granted. We don't really know where it comes from, but we know when we're transgressing the official view, right? If we transgress it too much, they might put us, in an insane asylum or something like that. So that's kind of the idea that he has in mind. What would be examples of this then, just to try to clear up this notion a little bit more? Perhaps something like Christian metaphysics in an earlier era, right? That's the official view of being. To deny, in a certain era, to deny the idea of human beings as creatures of a divine creator would be to, in a sense, commit a sort of official violation of the official view, right? In our era, it might be something more like materialism or naturalism. Certainly nowadays, we are very made aware daily of the cult, hopefully that's not too biased way of putting it, but the cult of expertise, right? In our era, we tend to believe that the people who have the correct or official view of being are the people who are experts in the various the various areas. So the experts, the one who has the view of what health is, right, are people who are in the healthcare industry, who are experts in that area. I don't know why I keep on wanting to say era. I've got eras on my mind because, of course, what we're talking about here is relativism that's relative to particular eras. So in the modern era, and now I do mean to say era, not area, people are becoming aware of the social status of truth. We are aware of history. And insofar as we're aware of history, we become aware of the fact that views of truth have changed. Views of being have changed. What was the official view in one era is no longer the official view in another era. And so this tends to undermine people's confidence in official views in general. And remember, he's an American. And so he's going to have a natural sort of rebellious contrarian streak, natural skepticism about the official views of things, right? It's natural for us as Americans to be skeptical of the government. And so in calling something the official view of something, there's already a kind of connotation here that maybe we better not take this as seriously as it presents itself to be. All right, well, we can discuss whether Stevens is right about this. He's right about this view of truth, whether this is an adequate definition of philosophy, but it seems to be an axiom of his discussion. Now, against this background of his definition of philosophy, Stevens will define poetry. So I go to my handy whiteboard here again. So if philosophy is the official view of being, then poetry is the unofficial view of being. Nice, neat contrast there that he wants to draw. And of course, this also tends to place poetry as sort of in the sexier position of being in the outsider, the rebel, the outlaw, right? Unofficial, outside the law, on the boundaries. Poetry is the bad boy, so to speak, and philosophy is the good boy. So we don't want to miss the rhetorical effects of this way of defining their contrast. Now, that being said, Stevens immediately acknowledges, he says, this is a much larger definition of poetry than it's usual to make. just to say that poetry is a view of being, even if unofficial, is to say a lot about poetry. It's not just something that's, pleasant to listen to, a nice turn of phrase that provides us with aesthetic pleasure, but rather it contains a kind of metaphysical import. It's in competition with philosophy in the way in which the official view of anything is going to be in contrast with an unofficial view of the same thing. So this is, he says, a large claim being made for poetry. There's a further parallel here. Just as the nature of truth changes on Stephen's view, so too does the nature of poetry change. So poetry evolves, lives and dies just as philosophy does. And so again, the definition of poetry will be relative to a particular time and era. Another point about the relationship between philosophy and poetry, and this is one that is very well rooted in the tradition and is not going to be surprising to anyone with familiarity with the tradition. And that is that, wait for it, you already know what I'm going to say because you have read the text, that philosophy pertains to reason. Philosophy is of reason, or the reason, as Stephen says, whereas poetry is of the imagination. So what he means by reason, what he means by imagination are things that are, again, open to discussion. But the initial point he makes before really defining these things, and again, remember these definitions, he said, are just for the sake of convenience. It's not meant to be any kind of a final word on what philosophy is or what poetry is. He says, in a universe of life and death, both reason and imagination can live and die. In a universe of life and death, both reason and imagination can live and die. Why is that significant? Reason can die? Imagination can die? Think about that for a minute. What do you think about that idea? There's something that is distinctly modern about it. It represents a kind of acknowledgement of the modern view of the finitude of humanity in the universe. If we think of reason not as a kind of transcendent reality, think about Plato's forms, something like that, or the view that logic, this is a view very common in ancient philosophy, the view that something like logic is woven into the very structure of reality. If instead of that view, we have the view that reason is just something that ultimately exists, has whatever existence it has in the human brain, in human psychology. And our brains came into existence and will go out of existence as a species. So reason can die if that's the case. There might be a reality in which there is no reason any longer. There are no sentient species who have reason. And likewise with the imagination. And Stevens is writing here in a tradition that would tend to laud reason and imagination as higher transcendent realities over nature, especially in the Kantian tradition. Both reason and imagination are regarded as things that transcend nature. There is in Kantian idealism this idea of a transcendental imagination, an imagination that shapes and forms reality. And that was very influential for the Romantics. You will recall, we've mentioned this before. But in the universe of life and death, both reason and imagination can live and die. So there you have a very modern understanding of how we are situated in relationship to the universe. A stark naturalism that opposes both the Christian and Platonic understanding of the transcendence of reason and the Romantic view of the transcendence of the imagination. Okay. At the bottom of 40 and onto 41, Stevens brings up this funny anecdote about Coleridge. And I'm not going to go into it, but I invite you to reread it here. It's a is an anecdote about when Coleridge was traveling abroad and ran into a group of philosophers. But the moral of this is something I want to draw out, is that approaching Coleridge as a philosopher is a multiple ironic misunderstanding. He doesn't see himself as a philosopher. That's clear from the anecdote. He says that I had the greatest disgust at philosophy and philosophers at this time. So he doesn't see himself as a philosopher, even as an aversion to them. So taking him as such is not a good way to generate fellowship with Coleridge, because he has an aversion to philosophy. Yet that is the basis on which he comes to have a kind of fellowship with his traveling companions in this anecdote. So there's a kind of irony here. A further irony is that he actually was a philosopher of sorts, if philosophy is about defining important things. And he was defining poetry all his life. And that's the point that Stevens wants to make about Coleridge. Coleridge was defining poetry all his life. And we've seen that earlier in this course where we discussed this feature of Coleridge's output. So what are we to say about these definitions of poetry? Of course, Stevens has just given us a kind of definition, but this is not an official definition, so to speak, right? It's a provisional definition for the sake of convenience. What about Coleridge's definitions? He says, like with James's comment about Bergson, it's the poetry of the definitions, the euphony of them that impresses us more than their validity, more than their logical compellingness. We look past the philosophical clothes to see how it dances, metaphorically speaking. About these definitions, Stevens's view is that none of them are adequate. They can't possibly be adequate. And we shouldn't try to find a definition of poetry that's really adequate. The best provisional definition we might be able to give is to see poetry as an approach to truth or being by way of the imagination. And that, of course, fits with his view of poetry as an unofficial view of being that pertains to the imagination. So poetry is an approach to truth or being by way of the imagination, but this isn't a definition, okay? So he cautions us against that, and the reasons for this will come out later on. And this is in contrast with philosophy, where we attempt to approach truth through reason. In saying that these are statements of convenience about poetry and about philosophy, he's also indicating here that it oversimplifies things to say that poetry is just about imagination and philosophy is just about reason. And I think this is a very important qualification to keep in mind. Clearly, philosophy involves imagination, and clearly poetry involves reason. But there's a greater emphasis on imagination in poetry and a greater emphasis on reason in philosophy. And so they're kind of idealizations, and that's part of the reason probably that he says we shouldn't regard these as real definitions, but just as statements of convenience. All right, so now we're up to page 42 in our analysis of this text towards the end of the second session. Here, Stevens asserts that we have to conceive of poetry as at least the equal of philosophy. As at least the equal of philosophy. Now think about that in relation to the tradition of Western philosophy. We know, we've commented on before, the fact that since the beginning, philosophy has marked out its own territory and jealously guarded it in distinction from and to the exclusion of poetry. And typically, the typical move of the philosopher is to exalt philosophy above poetry, and to say that philosophy is a greater approach to truth than poetry. So, if we think of modernism, as I said earlier, as a break with tradition, then this is a very modern statement. It turns Plato's elevation of poetry, or rather his elevation of philosophy above poetry, on its head, and elevates poetry above philosophy. At least the equal, suggesting that it's actually more than equal, it's better than philosophy. However, the sentiment behind this was at least a century old at the time. And we've seen already this idea of philosophy being surpassed by poetry, maybe necessarily at this particular historical era having to be surpassed by poetry. That's a very romantic idea in a lot of ways, too. It might even be described as the standard view of Romanticism. But it's still not the common sense view, far from it. In an era of materialism, naturalism, scientism, the view that philosophy is subordinate to poetry or inferior to poetry with respect to truth is still a very countercultural notion. Philosophy in our culture is closely tied to science, often regarded as providing foundations for science or analysis of science. And science is regarded as the rightly, legitimately so, as the highest achievements of our pursuit of truth in the modern era. So this is still, even though it is very, very much a standard statement within the Romantic tradition, within the modern period, it's a countercultural notion still. It opposes, you might even say it opposes common sense to say that poetry is superior to philosophy in respect of truth. So, how is he going to justify this? That's a question we should naturally ask. What reasoning can he give us to justify this claim that poetry is superior to philosophy with respect to truth? Well, the basic starting point is the skepticism that he has gleaned from his canvassing of these elite figures of the intellectual culture of his time. The skepticism of philosophy that it's expressed in Bradley's quote, and that even is sort of, in a backhanded way, intimated by William James's analysis of Bergson's work, where he praises it, remember, for its euphony, but not for its truth. So there's a kind of skepticism in the air that seems to infect even philosophers themselves, a skepticism about philosophy. So this provides us with a basic starting point. What leads us to be skeptical? What leads us to be skeptical about philosophy? What's the answer? It has to do with the way in which philosophy fails to meet its own expectations. It's a particular kind of approach to truth that fails to meet its own expectations. Philosophy produces rational ideas, and as such, these are expected to satisfy our reason. Thus, if they don't satisfy our reason, we become skeptical of that philosophy. Now, poetry, in a parallel fashion, produces imaginative ideas. Imaginative ideas are expected to satisfy our imagination. Thus, in this case, if these ideas don't satisfy our imagination, we become, we might say, skeptical of that poetry. It's kind of an odd turn of phrase, but what do we say about poetry that doesn't satisfy our imagination? We might say something like it leaves us cold. Maybe it just bores us. It leaves us feeling like we're not satisfied with it. Okay? Now, conversely, a rational idea may or may not satisfy the imagination. It doesn't need to satisfy the imagination, but still be rationally satisfying. And an imaginative idea is not expected to satisfy reason. What Stevens is doing here is he's pointing out the way in which there are different standards for imaginative ideas and, think about like the plot of an epic poem or something like that, or the particular piece of imagery, right, as an imaginative idea. There are certain standards that's expected to satisfy. You might think of something like Dante's Inferno as an imaginative idea of what hell is, that historically people have tended to find very satisfying. Not that they would want to be there and they would be satisfied there, but it's satisfying to the imagination, right? It somehow seems to continue to feed the imagination, one way in which it satisfies it. Whereas rational ideas, oftentimes the idea of hell, for many people, has been found to be an unsatisfying rational idea. How could a perfectly loving God condemn people to an eternity of torment, even, very bad people? Maybe 1,000 years, okay, but eternity, right? So this has been found by many people, it's been argued, to be an unsatisfying rational idea. But it still might be something that's imaginatively very engaging to the imagination. So there are different standards for imaginative ideas and rational ideas, is a point he's making there on page 42, which I'm paraphrasing. Now, there are two different standards then. There's the standard of reason, right, and the standard of the imagination. There are rational ideas that pertain to reason and imaginative ideas that pertain to the imagination. And there are different standards that apply to rational ideas and to imaginative ideas. He makes the point that an idea that satisfies both reason and the imagination would be essentially a big deal. He says here, this is about 10 lines from the bottom of page 42. From this analysis, we deduce that an idea that satisfies both the reason and the imagination, if it happened, for instance, to be an idea of God, would establish a divine beginning and end for us, which at the moment the reason singly at best proposes, and on which at the moment the imagination singly merely meditates. This is an illustration. That's a difficult sentence, because he's making a general point by introducing one instance of it, the idea of God. So he says, what if there were an idea of God that satisfied both the reason and the imagination? And this is meant to be a way of illustrating what it would be for both of these standards to be satisfied at the same time. The rational standard that pertains to ideas of reason and the imaginative standard that it pertains to ideas of the imagination. And he says, if we could have an idea, for example, an idea of God that satisfied both reason and imagination perfectly, this would establish a divine beginning and end for us. Establish a divine beginning. It would be the Alpha and the Omega. It's a poetic, rhetorically dense phrase, but clearly there's the idea here that this would be it, right? It would be the divine beginning and end for us. This would be completely satisfying to us if we could have an idea that satisfied both the reason and the imagination. Okay. Now, he goes on to say that the poet, in order to fulfill himself, must accomplish a poetry that satisfies both the reason and the imagination. In other words, Wallace Stevens seems to be saying that the poet must also be a philosopher. And here we make explicit something that's really been in the background here, which is that it's not an either or. We're human beings. We're complete human beings. There's a little bit of philosophy in our mind and a little bit of poetry. Or we could say we have a philosophical side of our mind and a poetic side of our mind, a rational and an emotional or imaginative side. And excuse me. And so we want to satisfy both those aspects of our personality. We don't want to compartmentalize, ideally, unless we're forced to. And so the poet is also going to aspire to philosophize, and the poet's ideas that the poet is working with aspire, at least ideally, to be both rationally and imaginatively satisfying. Okay, so if the poet is a philosopher, this immediately raises the question, is the poet in the same sorry situation that the philosopher is in the modern era? Namely, apparently subject to skepticism, relativism, barred from the truth, and ultimately being left unfulfilled and unsatisfied. Philosophy seems to end, he says here now, in despair. This is the top of page 43. Does the poet also then end in despair if the poet also tries to provide a kind of satisfaction to the philosophical side of our brain? No. I'm going to quote him now, beginning on the second line on page 43. On the contrary, if the end of the philosopher is despair, the end of the poet is fulfillment, since the poet finds a sanction for life in poetry that satisfies the imagination. Thus, poetry, which we have been thinking of as at least the equal of philosophy, may be its superior. So here's the vindication, the culmination of this argument, that poetry may actually be the superior of philosophy. Why? Because there's a sanction for life to be found in the imagination that is not to be found in reason. That's the claim. It might be too much to call it an argument. But at any rate, that's the perspective that he's presenting here. Poetry, which we may have been thinking of as at least the equal of philosophy, may be its superior because the poet finds a sanction for life in poetry that satisfies the imagination. So that's really staking out the ground that he's going to try to cultivate now and to explain to us. Okay, so I'm going pretty slowly through the first two sections, and we see we're almost out of time here. I don't want to go for longer than another 5 minutes. So I'm going to go more quickly over the third section, which basically argues that there's no definition of poetry hitherto that's been successful. So he goes through and he discusses Aristotle's definition of poetry from the Poetics. He charges that Aristotle, perhaps Plato, really didn't even have the concept of literature. And for us, poetry is literature more often than not. For Aristotle and for Plato, poetry might have been this thing called mimesis, or imitation, which we've spoken of before, about mimesis. Mimesis, imitation or representation, which, according to Stevens' view, is something different from literature. So that doesn't have to do with what we tend to think of as poetry. So it's not a definition that is something that is useful for us anymore. He goes on to talk about Shelley, who we've looked at in the course in the past, and the idea of poetry as the center and circumference of life. And it raises this question whether there is a center of poetry. This is an idea, remember, in Rilke that was very important, the idea of the center. The idea of there being some oneness or unity from which the imagination flows and which can generate ever new poetic forms and renew the human spirit continually, era after era. But it's coming from some origin, it's coming from some center. And it's clear that Stevens, as a modernist poet, is skeptical of this idea. Of there being a center, a life or living node of poetry, right? The node, the point at which all the different lines of poetic influence intersect, all the different strains of poetry and the poetic movements all intersect. They all go back to this origin, the living node of poetry. And clearly, he doesn't believe that there's much of that notion that we can give credence today. Okay. What does he replace this with then? The idea is, although we can recognize poetry, this is not because there's a center of poetry awaiting discovery. There's no Xanadu like in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, right? There's no realm of the imagination that we can access to. That's the center of poetic knowledge, the office of creativity that we can draw upon. If we recognize poetry, it doesn't come from a center awaiting discovery, according to Stevens, but rather, if there is a center, it's a process in the personality of the poet. Okay, so this is something we can add to our account of poetry here. It's centered in the personality of the poet. And I put centered here in scare quotes to indicate that this center is not a fixed center. It's something dynamic. And it's not something that is independent of the product of creation itself, which is a very important point. Now, this might seem to contradict what I said initially about modernism favoring objectivity as opposed to personality. But this is an important distinction here. he's not trying to say that poetry is centered in the particular emotions and the particular expressions of the poet so much as it is centered in the particular way of seeing that's characteristic of the poet. So in 46 and 47, at the end of this section, there's some quotes from Cézanne where he talks about a kind of indirect egoism. And that's important. The personality of the poet, we can even add this here. It relates to an indirect egoism, as opposed to egotism, rather, he says. Egotism. Well, I won't try to correct that there. It's an indirect egotism. It's not an egotism. It's not, I'm asserting myself and my personal idiosyncrasies. But it's an attempt to see, to have a vision of the object in front of you. Call it nature. That is really honest, would be one way to put it. That your own original discovery, that the way the thing appears to you. You're not trying to assert yourself, some kind of internal ego, some kind of Cartesian ego that you're trying to express. But in the quote from Cézanne on page 47, he says, the sole and unique aim is seeing and feeling from out of one's total individual personality. Okay. Well, I fell a little bit short. I want to end this video now, and I only got through the first 3 sections. I want to get through the first 4, but that's the way it goes. So I'm going to end this now, and I invite you to add comments before the next video. I'm going to try to post this at 2 o'clock on Monday, April 6th. The succeeding video will be posted on April 8th at approximately 2 o'clock. And so if you could add comments to the comment box here before that video posts, that will satisfy your substitute attendant requirement, which has now become a comment requirement. Remember that you are entitled to keep your comments anonymous, so if you want to use a pseudonym, that's perfectly fine, and if I can't figure out who you are, then please email me and tell me what your pseudonym is, so I'll be able to give you credit for that. And of course, as always, if there are any questions, please go ahead and email me and keep in touch. So I hope this video is useful to you, and we'll continue on this way.